Welcome to Design Downtime, the podcast where we celebrate the joys of living a balanced creative life. I'm your host, Guy Siegel, a design director in Toronto, Canada, and I invite you to join me on this journey as we redefine what it means to be a successful design professional. Let's break free from the shackles of hustle culture and embrace the full spectrum of human experience, because life is too precious to be spent only in pursuit of productivity. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Amy Lee. Amy is a design system leader who believes in the power of collaboration. She has created and led design system teams at large companies like Salesforce and DocuSign, as well as smaller startups. Amy believes that design systems can be a party where everyone is invited. Amy is also an engineer and a musician. She loves the process of creating things and wondering how to make things exist. She has no formal audio engineering training, but has built 2 shipping iPad-based music-making apps. She'll be performing guitar live on stage. She has 4 more months to learn to play guitar. And lately, she's gotten pretty deep into 3D printing and CAD modeling, because why not? Amy lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and enjoys going for walks with her husband. Amy, hello.
Hello. Is this where the party is?
That is today where the party is, yes.
Ooh.
Because you're here.
And you're here. And I think that's amazing.
I agree. So you want to talk about 3D printing?
I do. I've kind of gotten this bug about like creating things. What is your concept of 3D printing?
I've seen 3D printers. I've seen objects that were printed using those usually home-based 3D printers. That's pretty much it, to be honest.
Yeah, right. Like you think of it as this kind of like machine that lays down this plastic thread and it just kind of goes back and forth, right? And then suddenly a few hours later, suddenly you have like a dragon, right? And then, or you have like a Harry Potter character or something like that. So that was my concept of like what a 3D printer is. And it technically does that, but it does so much more. And how you get it to do that is like fascinating to me.
So obviously you're, part of the tech world. You've been exposed to, you've seen 3D printers, and then, as you said, something changed for you.
Yeah. I was thinking about different things I wanted to like build, or like things that like I saw like maybe a little figurine or something, and I said, oh, that's kind of cute. I mean, it looks like you could go and buy that, or maybe you can make it at home. And I started thinking back to some like my experiences, because a long time ago, I joined an art tech group here in San Francisco, and they had all these like access to like 3D printers and other artists who were already doing this stuff. I mean, this is not new technology, right? And it kind of inspired me to think like, oh, you can just create everything from like a small figurine to like a dress. And like it kind of sat in the back of my mind. And more recently, I just had a lot of like sort of like time to think about things. And I was like, wait, can I do that? Sure, why not? Let's go get a 3D printer. So I borrowed a 3D printer from a friend, and I just started making stuff like tiny little boxes and little pieces of art. It was kind of cool.
So were you printing those things to sort of test the limits or the possibilities of what can be done?
Yeah, in a way. Like I always kind of like walk into a new hobby, as it were. Like I kind of walk into these hobbies not really knowing what I don't know, and just kind of go, that seems cool. A lot of people like it. Why do they like it? And then I just kind of got curious and kept going.
So what did you like about it?
I kind of like the process of just kind of going like, okay, I can think about maybe downloading something and printing it, but then how did the artist actually create that stuff? Like what software did they use? And that sent me down this huge rabbit hole of like, oh, hey, but what is CAD? I mean, I know what CAD is. It's like lines on a computer screen, and like you can make a 3D model and you flip it around. But like, I never really thought about like, how do you make something? Because it's kind of weird to like use a flat screen to make like a 3D object. And like, it's not like I have like 3D powered glasses around here. It's just kind of like, oh, I have a mouse and a keyboard. How can I do this? And it turns out you need certain mice, because otherwise life is very difficult. You need certain software, and you need to know all this world of terminology. It's crazy. My first like 2 or 3 months were like a real struggle.
Was that just a, YouTube tutorial after another?
It's funny, like YouTube University is literally the way everybody learns now. I mean, it just like you try to read some of this documentation, the documentation's out of date, or they use terminology for a different version of the software that you might have. Like you get a free license to something and you don't have access to this one package. And you're just like, oh, well, thanks for like getting my hopes up. And now I have to like kind of reinvent what that package is, or you have to pay a lot of money. I'm like, I'm a hobbyist. I don't have that money.
So what were some of those first things that you designed yourself?
The very first thing I designed was a Lego brick. I went through this tutorial on Autodesk's Fusion 360. And it was just like, here, we're going to teach you about this word called extrusion. I'm like, okay, extrude, fine, whatever. And it's like, okay, start by drawing a sketch. Why would I draw a sketch? I just want a block to exist, right? But then you go down this road of like, okay, you take a drawing and then you kind of like pull it in like the height of it, and suddenly now you have a brick, and you can take the brick and you can add these things to it, and like, oh, those are the studs. And what about the bottom? Okay, well, you can hollow that out so you can make a shell of it, and then you start adding other things, and at the end of it, it was so weird. It was just like, this is not going to work. It's totally not going to work. I just followed the instructions on this one tutorial, and I put in all like the very, very exact parameters, and then it printed a brick. And then I pulled out some Legos and I just like clicked the two things together, and it was an exact fit. And I'm like, what is this magic? And that was like, I don't know, like 4 months ago, 5 months ago.
So that's interesting, because what you described, the process that they walked you through, the way you describe it sounds unintuitive, right? Instead of saying, I want a brick, you're saying, here's a 2D object or 2D drawing that I'm sort of pulling and extruding to become 3D.
Yeah, it's, I think for you and I, we understand the flat world very well. Like you can kind of think of like the flat world with like Photoshop layers, like, oh, here's a screen. And then you put like, I don't know, a component on that, and you kind of like build it up in like onion skin layers, and it kind of like makes a thing, like whoopie-doo. But like when you start dealing with 3 dimensions, your brain has to completely rewire itself. It's just like everything from like, you're looking at the screen and going like, I want to see the backside of this object. So you flip it over on the backside and you're just like, wait, which way was up? And that was the weirdest thing. It's just like, I don't know if you've ever like thought about like going to like a playground and then like hanging on like the bars or something and suddenly like flipping upside down. Everything is backwards. And until your brain can like sort of reorient, and honestly, it takes like a couple weeks, but it works. But like until you reorient, everything is weird. It's like I had to like spend probably like several weeks of just kind of like messing up really, really badly, and kind of like putting blocks on top of blocks and going like, wait, this is in the wrong place. And then you flip it right side up and you're like, oh, that is definitely in the wrong place. That looks stupid. But you keep iterating, and then you keep printing these things into the real world, and you start to understand like, oh, if I do a block and put this one like peg on one side, when it prints, oh, it looks like this. And so if I make 2 blocks with 2 pegs, oh, maybe I can make them kind of link together. That's really cool. And so this kind of all started as just kind of like a lark. It was just like a few months ago, I'm like, I haven't really gotten into 3D printing, and I thought about my experiences, and then I was just like, oh, I wonder if I can make more things exist. And so I've been making bigger and bigger and more complex things. I'm pretty far in now.
So going from that Lego brick, the first experiment, what was your evolution into those bigger and more possibly complex objects?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is just learning the sort of like mindset of these people. And like I've kind of talked about like how to like what projects I'm kind of working on all my hobbies. Like I've been talking about it pretty openly with like friends and other people, and they've said, hey, by the way, you should talk to this other person. And so I do. And I've made a whole bunch of new friends just because I've been just talking about it for so long now. And this one person's like, oh yeah, I think about the problem in this way. And I went, really? I've been thinking about the problem inside out. Because like, okay, here's the big brain twister. when I first started, I thought, oh, I'm just going to make a bunch of things and print them. I'm going to make like a block and tape the block and extend it and then like cut my name into it or something like that. And that works. But let's say you want to actually get somebody else to make it. Like you want somebody else to like make it on a machine that's not a 3D printer. You have to think about it backwards. You have to think about, okay, I have a block. Let me make the block big enough that I can whittle it down. And I went, what is this magic? It's like you have to think about like, is my original like piece of wood going to be large enough to hold the hole that this thing will be in? And like 3D printing gives you a way to kind of cheat that because you can just make anything exist. But if you want to make 3D printing as like prototyping for other stuff, it's like, wow, that is crazy.
That sounds actually very similar to doing things by hand because you have to adjust the way you're thinking about solving the problem or the way you're designing it to match the way that the machine or the tool is going to create it.
Exactly. Let's say you wanted to, I don't know, whittle down a piece of wood because you're making like a big bear sculpture, right? So like you get a log and then you start cutting it down. So you have the original thing and you just kind of keep shaving it down until you get a bear. That is exactly the opposite of like making modeling where you just kind of like build up an object. And I think there's no one right way to do it. It's just kind of like, how do you want the end product to be? If you 3D print things, they end up being like kind of like rough on the outside because you have to kind of like build up enough material that you can then like sand it back down. And by the way, plastic, I had no idea like what plastic was made of. And like there were so many kinds of plastic and there's so many kinds of like filaments. So the thing you print with is called a filament, which is basically a long piece of plastic that's been turned into a thread. And it's just like when the filaments come together, they don't come together cleanly. They just never do. And like you start printing things and like the filaments start melting and suddenly you have this like weird leaning tower of Pisa. Worse yet, you can get these things where like you build an object that's high and the filament starts to kind of make cotton candy threads. That's been my latest challenge. Coming from a software background, everything is so neat. It's like you have a variable like x equals 4. You have this like component. It's a perfect rectangle. It's exactly like 30 pixels wide. In the real world, nothing is exact. Nothing stays the same. And it's so hard to control this thing. It's kind of like suggesting to the printer, hey, I think you should make this mug. And most of the time you get most of the mug. And then you have to deal with like the extra like 1% of like weirdness. Like, oh, this mug now has this extra like ridge on it. Like, I didn't put it there. No, the material just did it. And you're just like, great. Now I have like 2 hours of sanding. Thank you.
So you mentioned that it took you about 2 weeks to sort of get used to this different way of thinking of how to model those objects.
Yeah.
Has it had any effect on the way you're looking at other problems or looking at other sort of models?
In a way, in sort of like a big roundabout way, I would say. When you're making some of these complex structures, you don't build them as a single part. You build them as like a set of parts that kind of come together. And when you have like 2 or more parts coming together, that's called an assembly. And you take assemblies and you build assemblies of assemblies. And you can kind of think about like, how do interfaces come together? And, you know, it's like, okay, what are the constituent parts? What parts are repeatable? What parts aren't? How do the assemblies kind of link together? And like there are physical connections. And like, how do you design for that? I mean, I don't know. This is a pretty abstract question. So it's like, yeah, I mean, I think that I've thought a lot about how does a big object get composed of smaller little objects, which are themselves composed of smaller little objects. In a way, it's almost like organizing like a company or something like that. Like, you know, you have people who do a certain thing and that role, and then you kind of like get them to do certain outputs. And so it's kind of all shaping output through language and design.
When did 3D printing become past that stage of you playing and trying to understand how to work with it into something that you had an idea in mind that you're working towards?
I think I was just, sitting on the couch and I was like, wow, my TV remotes are just rolling around on the couch. Well, I mean, you go like, well, maybe I should put the remotes in a different place, or maybe I can go and buy a TV remote caddy or something like that. And I thought about it, I'm like, wait a minute, I got a 3D printer. I can make anything. And so I've been designing a little caddy that specifically fits my couch. So my husband and I, we often find ourselves on the same couch. He's usually playing video games. I'm usually like reading a book or playing on my computer or something like that. And it's kind of like a 2-seat couch with a small, tiny sort of like space between the two cushions. And I'm like, oh, that'd be a great place to like put the remote caddy. Because like you get these caddies and they just like sit on a table and then I'm just going to knock that over. But like I would like a little tray. And I specifically want it for our 4 remote controls. And the remote controls are all different sizes. And also we have this thing where like we plug our phones in. And so we have all these like little USB cables. And I looked at that and went like, you know what? There is not a off-the-shelf thing, but you know what? I have CAD. I can just take a measurement. So I just pulled out my little tape measure. And I'm like, okay, I need it this many inches wide, this many inches tall. And it's like, yeah, it just takes a while to print. That's all. But I think it's really cool. It's just like, it shifts you from this like consumer kind of mindset where you just have to go out and like flick through Instagram until you find the one thing that you go like, oh, this is the one missing piece from my house. And going like, wait, I can just make that. And you can make it in a way that just, it doesn't like look horrible.
That's fascinating because it kind of like, it's another aspect of self-sufficiency, right? Where you said you don't need to go out and search for something for an existing solution. You can make one yourself.
Or you can take an existing solution and kind of improvise around it. Let's say people make like rubber mats and I don't have the capability to make like a rubber mat, but you could take a rubber mat, cut it down, and now you have like a part of a rubber mat and you can just build a thing around it. There's this cool trick when you're 3D printing where you're in your model, when it's being printed, you can add a pause. Like you can literally tell the printer, by the way, hold on just a second. So like you see people print like maybe a third of the model and then they'll open the printer doors and they'll put down something in the middle and they'll say resume print. And it's like, you now have like 2 parts that are totally separate. Now they're completely joined in an impossible way because like the printer's just printing filament over this thing. It's like, yeah, so like I could have a rubber mat in the middle of this like TV caddy.
Does that change the way you look at your house, at the world, and find those solutions that maybe without 3D printing were not possible?
Yeah, right now I'm kind of in this like deep exploration about like, can I get stuff to hold stuff? Because like I just have a lot of hobbies, right? Like, I mean, you've seen, sort of pictures of my home office, which is nothing but projects. I mean, like music gear everywhere, there's computer stuff everywhere. And when you have a lot of hobbies, you have a lot of stuff. And it's and the part of me that is like, coming from sort of like the professional background of like, oh, everything should be neat and in its place and well labeled. And I look around my room and I go like, wow, I'm such a hypocrite. But now I can look at this and go, well, how would I organize this? And now so I've gone down this new totally direction of like, oh, I wonder if I can do 3D printing, CNC stuff, and kind of like make myself a little bookshelf. But not just any bookshelf, like a bookshelf exactly for that one tall book that was too tall to fit in like my old IKEA thing.
So that opens a whole new world of custom objects for yourself.
And I think that's great. There's this whole thing of like buying stuff off the shelf and that's kind of cool because you're kind of part of this sort of like club of whoever's bought that item. Like let's say you buy a really cool like thermos and everybody else buys the same thermos. It's like, oh yeah, I have one of those thermoses. Or you buy this like cool like little 4-inch lunchtime cooler bag from a grocery store and everybody else buys that same bag. It's just like cool. Like that's kind of a moment in history where you're like, oh, I'm part of that club. But then you start thinking about all the other moments of your life. You're like, I have a bunch of stuff. Maybe I can make something custom. I can make stuff custom like to display the stuff. Or maybe there's 2 things that just didn't work together. It's like, oh, I didn't have a place to like connect two things. Like I can just make that happen. It's like you get really good at just kind of like eyeballing things and going like, huh, I could do that.
So you said you always have a few projects on the go. What are some of the projects you have that involve 3D printing?
So like right now, I think it all comes back to like me just trying to organize things. So like I have like speakers on top of my desk and they're kind of just like sitting here. It'd be nice if I had a better sort of like stand for them. Or I have all these cables. So like I wish that I had a better cable organizer because I've kind of gotten into guitars and so there's cables everywhere now.
You mentioned CNC. Is that the same as 3D printing, or is that something that's a bit different?
CNC is kind of the reverse of 3D printing. So like you can see like my hobbies kind of link together in interesting ways. It's like you do one hobby and that leads to yet another hobby. If 3D printing is sort of like building stuff up, CNC is like kind of whittling things down. And so I'm starting to look at like, well, maybe I'll join a maker shop. I've actually started to kind of venture into other places, like kind of outside the walls of my home. And that's really interesting. Like there's people that say they make clay. And often you don't make clay in your house. Like it takes a lot of equipment. Like you need a kiln, you need places to dry things. I mean, if you have a big garage, that's great. But like a lot of people join a clay shop or a studio, right? Like especially if you live in like an urban area, like you just need the space. And I think CNC is kind of much the same thing, where you just need space. That's another thing I've learned is that the world of physical materials is very, very messy. Wood is like amazing. Like I never, like you and I think about wood probably the same way. It's like, oh, it comes from a tree and you make boards and you nail them together. But then you start like trying to work with wood and that's an entirely new category of just like mess. Wood does not want to stay together. And if you cut wood, there's sawdust. And I didn't really think about sawdust like super deeply until I started getting into CNC machining. By CNC, we mean usually like the big kind of like arm with like a rotating bit that goes back and forth. That kind of like CNC routing, wow, it is so loud and so messy. You can't do it at home.
And what can you do with it that you can't do with a 3D printer?
It's weird because like CNC routing, you can basically do anything on a flat surface. I mean, some people do some more like 3D kind of things, like maybe you'll like, I don't know, carve like a fish sculpture to hang on the wall. Like you kind of make the bit kind of like go up and down. That's pretty hard. It also requires a bit of like sort of like processing after the fact. But like you're mostly dealing with flat objects, like a flat board, a flat piece of wood, or, you know, a flat piece of metal. That's mostly what you're doing with a CNC router. So you have to think about, okay, do I want something that's just flat and maybe textured? Or do I want something that like is flat and you put a couple of flat things together and suddenly, now you have furniture.
So is that your direction now?
I don't know. I think the answer is yes, but it's kind of like, it took me a while to get into 3D printing and get the mindset of like, okay, how do I make a 3D object and calibrate my brain towards that? And now with like kind of getting towards like CNC furniture, now it's like, okay, how do I take flat planes and then join them together? And there's like a million ways to do it. You can do traditional carpentry. You can do like metal fasteners. You can do screws and nails and glue and all these things. You could just kind of lean things together. That is an all-consuming new hobby, and I don't know. But I'm kind of having fun right now, just like printing plastic. It's fun making anything just kind of exist.
For you personally, is there a difference between let's go back to talking about wood, a woodworker, you know, working with their hands and building furniture versus a machine doing it? Is there still a stigma that the custom, bespoke woodworker is higher quality or more acceptable as a form of maybe even art?
I think if you're talking about like making things for yourself, I think then the sky's the limit. Like you can do traditional like hand tools You could, there's people who say that you shouldn't even use like machines. You should just use hand tools. Like if you want to get into like Japanese style joinery, you can do it the very, very traditional way of just like nothing but hand saws. And you get like amazing results. Like you can build like very large structures. I think machines allow you to do a lot of repetitive things very quickly. And if you get really good at the machines, I mean, that's fine. And I think that, you start looking at like what CNC can do for you and, 3D printing and all these other machines. It's like, it's just another machine. Does it really take the soul of the art out? Well, I think that's more of a question of like, what was the original design intent? If it's for you, doesn't matter. If it's for somebody else, I mean, then now, yeah, you're playing with perception. I mean, almost everything, even the high-end furniture these days, it's all machine made because it's so hard to do it consistently as a human. I mean, if you want slightly unstable things, then I mean, I guess you can do it as a human. Beyond, very specific shops, almost everything is machine made. I mean, it might be hand finished, just to say that, like, oh, hey, there's a bit of like human labor that went into it, stuff that like artificial intelligence can't do. I think there's a sort of like beauty aspect to being like hands on the material. But then there's also a very practical aspect, like you need to do a lot of cuts for a very long time, and you need to be really precise. Humans are not built for that.
What have been some of the surprises or unexpected things that happened when you started working with 3D printing and CNC?
I think when you sort of get into these like deep type of like manufacturing techniques, you begin to look at the world deeper. I mean, isn't that what like art history is all about? Is like it's developing an appreciation for the thought processes and the techniques for things, and then you can never look at a painting the same way or a drawing the same way. You go like, oh yeah, that's really hard, or that's really interesting. And I think like when you think about how products get made, it helps you kind of understand that like today's products are made to be like disposable. And I'm kind of now of the opinion that we should make products that last a much longer time. But if you're going to do that, well, how would you change the manufacturing of this thing? Would you make better fasteners? Would you use different materials that are more sustainable? It's like you kind of become a critic of how things are made. Like, and it extends from everything from just like, the small mug on my desk all the way up to like the house that I'm sitting in. It's just like, wow, things are made in really interesting ways. And a lot of them are just made for speed. I think we're at an interesting point in history where maybe we should think about things which are longer lasting. And if they're going to be longer lasting, they have to be well made. If they're going to be well made, they're going to have a lot of details. And that just takes time and artistry.
That's wonderful. Amy, where can people find you?
These days, you can track most of my adventures. I'm starting to like post more stuff online. I have a personal website. It is jumpingrobot.com. Those are two completely random words that I threw together, jumping and robot.com, but it seems to work, and I've had that domain forever, and it just kind of keeps evolving as I evolve, and so I keep adding more projects, more links, more stuff there.
It sounds like a wonderful destination to visit.
It's a party of a destination.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Amy.
All right, thanks.
This is all for this episode of Design Downtime. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, I hope you enjoy your downtime.